Hello and welcome to a special 2026 preview from Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that usually starts your political day, but this time starts your political year. If 2025 delivered enough adrenaline, surprise and sheer kinetic energy to power a small nuclear reactor, well, get ready for the year ahead.
God, didn't it just? Look, I remember when Keir Starmer was standing on the morning after the election telling the country, telling us that politics was going to tread more lightly on our lives. Well, spoiler alert, that simply hasn't happened. Listeners to our podcast don't really need reminding of that, but the tempo of stuff just seems to be going up and up.
So will Keir Starmer do better in the next 12 months or be in a job at the end of them? How does it look for Kemi Badenoch? Is it knives out, or has her improved performance and the deepening woes of Labour been enough to glue her in place through that big first local election test happening in May?
And will Keir Starmer's big-ticket policy items actually work in practice? Will foreign affairs dominate in 2026 like they did in 2025? And I think you would expect all of that to be on the agenda. I've got a much bigger question, and that I want to ask at the start of this podcast.
I know these are always really tough.
Yeah, I think there's a massive thing about next year. It's kind of so big that you could actually miss it. I wonder whether 2026 is the year that we have to conclude that British politics is just broken.
Always with the drama, Sam, but what do you actually mean by that?
You and I have been kicking around for quite a while now, but for over a decade, I think British politics has just not been functioning. It's obsessed with itself. It's why it keeps changing prime ministers and everything that goes with that. It's not focused on voters, and it simply isn't working. Parties are struggling to function. Successive prime ministers struggle to get things done. I really date this back to the Scottish referendum in independence, where we came awfully close to ripping apart the whole United Kingdom. But this all doubled down and became much bigger with the Brexit referendum. Now, the point about the Brexit referendum was because the divisions went through the middle of our political parties, it ripped apart our political parties, and those damage, that scarring really hasn't healed. I'd argue that it has left us unmoored as a nation. I don't think nationally we're that sure where we want to end up in terms of our relationship with Europe and the EU, and that creates an endless drag on absolutely everything else. And all of that has been a distraction, and it meant that things just aren't getting better for voters. The Prime Minister himself at the start of December was saying he would pull levers and nothing would happen. That was a year after he basically gave a speech, the Plan for Change speech, where he said exactly the same thing a year before, and things haven't got better over those 12 months. He didn't seem to acknowledge that he keeps saying the same thing again. Long-term challenges aren't being addressed. So if, and it's a big if we are going into a year where another Prime Minister could be slung on the funeral pyre, which will mean another year of Westminster navel-gazing that doesn't actually fix the things that need fixing, I repeat, does this signal that British politics is actually fundamentally quite broken?
I do see what you mean there, and the government machine is clearly struggling to deliver. It's a massive source of frustration inside it, and for voters, it's driving a lot of the dissatisfaction levels of our politics. The only thing I can offer is a bit of a counterpoint, perhaps, Sam, is that if you look around Europe very widely, a lot of these problems are shared, and they haven't had the kind of disruptions that you pointed out. I think this is really intriguing that you started even before the Brexit referendum. And it's true, we threw things up in the air. We asked people to make big calls. We threw the chips on the table. Coalition-based politics in Europe tends not to do that so much. And yet, as you know, I shuttle to and fro to Germany as the kind of unofficial ambassador. And what I see there is exactly the same questions being framed. That why are we not thriving? We're a big industrial country. What's gone wrong with our model, etc. Everything from its defence, but to the way that the country's actually functioning day to day. The French state massively over leveraged. We've covered budget politics and debt, and France is absolutely in a worse position than we are on all of that. The Nordic countries increasingly divided about how much to be open and blissfully Nordic and diverse, etc., or how should they clamp down on immigration and asylum if it's unsettling their societies. So I suppose I'm just saying it is a wee bit relative, and maybe this what you call broken is just the way it's just going to be politics doing its thing in Europe in the days that we live in.
So it's not really British exceptionalism, is your argument. It's common elsewhere. I just wonder whether or not they change leader quite as often.
In France, if you're prime minister, the answer is definitely yes.
Okay, let's get into the meat and potatoes of next year. We're structuring this around a whole series of big questions. So, Anne, do you want to just kick us off with the first one?
First big question. Keir Starmer, Kemi Badenoch, Ed Davey, Nigel Farage, do they all end the year leading the parties that they're in?
Right, this is the whopper. Why don't you answer it?
Thanks for that. Well, Keir Starmer. Oh, it's really easy. Keir Starmer might be harder to challenge than a lot of people now think or assume. Yes, events have got their own momentum. If those May elections go so badly for him, if there's just no pickup despite general improvement in some areas in the economy, if it's not good enough, is he very exposed? Yes. But who, Sam, is going to dip their hands in blood to get rid of this Prime Minister? A cabinet ally of Starmer said to me recently, there are a lot of hopefuls, there are a lot of people who are very dissatisfied, but who is going to be the one that says after 18 months, this Labour Party waiting so long to get back to power couldn't keep it together for a year and a half? And the risk there that you could lose to reform, you'd have to have an early election. There's lots of things that follow for the attempt to defenestrate Keir Starmer. So maybe he can use that to glue himself into power.
I think there's a lot in that. This is the hardest question that everybody is wrestling as we head into 2026. There's no doubt, right, that authority has drained away from the Prime Minister. You've got members of the cabinet talking about how he's got a time-limited future. They don't want him, in some cases, to succeed. It's not hard to find Labour MPs who are pretty distraught that the poll ratings would mean that they will be out of a job at the next election. And you've got that big electoral test in May that could prove pretty decisive. You've got pretty unprecedented poll ratings for Keir Starmer as well, and not a lot on the horizon that shows he's able to reset. But I just got a couple of observations. One of the things I had thought might glue him a bit more securely in place was the worry that if this Labour Party tosses him in the bin and there's a contest and some of the contenders promise to the Labour members who have to determine who wins that they will spend more money, then basically because we borrow so much as a country, the markets could freak out and there could be a bit of a Liz Truss moment, borrowing costs go up. I think that they are now already all thinking about that and thinking about ways of heading off exactly that threat. And I think you might find that if there is a contest, there is a less pronounced promise of changing the way things are done than Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. So for instance, we might find that there's a promise to change the personnel, whether it's Andy or Angela or Wes or any of the names that you see kicking around. But they promise to, for instance, all stick to the fiscal rules. So what you do is you go into the contest and to stop there being a market reaction. So that is the mechanism to stop kind of an existential amount of damage being done. But there is a lot of planning going on. But my observation of this Parliamentary Labour Party is that they are disloyal to Keir Starmer, but disunited amongst themselves, blowing with the wind, going hot and cold, extremely intemperate, particularly the 2024 intake, and the sheer force it requires to drag a prime minister from office is quite something. We have seen it, and it requires our level so much further beyond what I feel I'm experiencing at the moment.
And also the fact that Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves are glued together, having gone through that budget trauma in 2025, and it's Holmes and Moriarty. I think, do they have to go over the cliff together? That's even more of a push that you'd have to make. That's a very interesting point about keeping the rules intact, which point you might think, well, why are we doing this? Kemi Badenoch, shall I turn to her, Sam? Is there going to be upward momentum for her in May? Well, if there is, even if it's not that great, but it's something, I think she can make the case for staying because she clearly has had an improved performance. Her personal ratings have risen a bit. Overall, the picture's still a bit bleak for the Conservatives in the polls. If she can't do that, then I think the question arises, which has just been bubbling up all around her, which is it going to have to be a deal with reform in some form? I don't think she wants to do that. I don't think she can do that. And at that point, the Robert Jenrick-driven tumbrel, I think, will start to roll towards the Badenoch address.
The reason I think that Kemi Badenoch is more likely than not to stay in her job in 2026 is for exactly your last point. The Tory party don't need to decide until 6 to 9 months out from election what they do about reform, really. There's no hurry. in that question. There is time, and even Robert Jenrick argues this, there is time to see if Tory poll ratings improve. It's only 9 months out from an election that you really need to go, okay, if there's going to be some kind of mutual defence pact, we fight some seats, you fight others, and we don't really turn our firepower on each other. You don't need a long lead-in to do that. There is no need to change leader this year. So I think on balance, that means, in my mind, it's less likely to happen.
Okay. So Ed Davey, some rumblings that the party could do with a bit of a leadership refresh. It does have 72 MPs here. Kudos to Ed Davey on that. And yet there's still a bit of a sense it doesn't quite cut through. Even when it's polling, it looks pretty healthy. I know you've engaged a lot and you were at the Lib Dem conference this year. What's your assessment of whether he hangs about?
First of all, a sign of Lib Dem success would be you coming to their conference next year. So I'll book you in for that. Look, there was an extraordinary moment at Lib Dem conference where I was with a number of them and they did all start talking about whether or not Ed was the right leader for the Liberal Democrats. And they spied something which has come true. They spied there being somebody else in the space that they think they occupy doing really well. And that person's Zach Polanski. Now the Greens have overtaken. And part of that, some of them will acknowledge, is about the personality of Ed Davey, who's a bit more incremental, softly. And the problem is we now have a party hoovering up the votes on the left with charisma, with excitement, with pizzazz. Where was Zach Polanski politically before he was a Green? He was a Lib Dem. That is quite painful. They have, in our political journalism lifetimes, defenestrated a leader. That was, of course, Charles Kennedy. That was a deep wound and very hard for them. I think they find it even harder than Labour to do. So it's not odds on, but I wouldn't want to be Ed Davey because he's not going to be having a pleasant time.
Should we turn to making plans for Nigel and what happens to Reform UK? I'm thinking, when you talk about Nigel Farage, like, he's the one who's really kind of nailing it in terms of results, whatever people make of Reform's politics. There's been some signs of a bit of weakness there, organisationally at the back end of the year, Sam, and his testiness when he's challenged on anything to do with himself personally, in his own biography and his own views. Is there a bit of a key man risk coming on there for Reform, as we say in horrible corporate language, like it's all too much around this person?
100%. Look, it is the job of every single other political party to get Nigel Farage out of the job of leader of Reform UK. And if any one of them succeed, British politics changes again, like everything gets thrown up in the air, because whether they like it or not, Reform is Nigel Farage, is Reform is Nigel Farage. I know there are lots of other people doing what they think is great work, but it is about him. And I think that the entire political landscape would change if he wasn't there. I'm going to give you a couple other predictions. And as we look across the political landscape, people I don't think are going to be there. So I'm going to stick my neck out on a couple of them. One person I think will be gone, Cabinet Secretary Chris Wormold. There was a lot of chatter about him through the summer, through the autumn. Maybe the COVID inquiry would do for him. I think it's a bit inglorious to send a Cabinet Secretary packing off the back end of one, hostile report. But in the spring, I'm not sure that people aren't already thinking about where he could gently glide to and who might be the successors. I don't know, maybe Antonio Romeo, maybe Ollie Robbins, although he's had a much more difficult time than expected recently. I think there could be a big change at the top of the civil service. Will there be somebody with more pizzazz, I think is the question. But the other person who might go, it just looks increasingly difficult to see how Morgan McSweeney stays in his job. You can feel the direction of government policy going in a way that wasn't how he was steering the Labour Party when he was unambiguously in charge. There are other big characters in Downing Street. We talk a bit about Tim Allen, the Executive Director of Communications, who just seems to be effectively whispering the government into a different place, more sort of progressive friendly pose for this party, which is not how Morgan McSweeney envisaged it. Is he enjoying it? He was told to shut up and not brief journalists. He was nearly demoted after the summer. All of these things do not look like the kind of conditions where you would want to stay in the job. As much as everybody says, if Morgan goes, Keir's in really massive trouble.
You're pointing to a year of potential turbulence continuing in the number 10 operation. I mean, from the inside, how the sausage gets made probably never looks too pleasant under any Prime Minister and their team. But I think that's right. There's something a bit fizzy about it, a bit overreactive. It just needs to calm down a bit. But that sounds like you think there's going to be perhaps a couple of people leaving dues. The other person, I think, is just in a really difficult position. is David Lammy, is the Justice Secretary. We're seeing this pushback come very fast and furiously at him over those changes to jury trials. And he sort of feels like he's ended up in a liminal space, having been taken out of the Foreign Office, put into this job, and Deputy Prime Minister, but with a Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. I think not saying his survival chances are zero next year, but I think he's like in quite a difficult place of people in Cabinet.
In general, I think we both agree that it just is that feeling of instability at the top. Now, the thing that will either supercharge or calm that down, probably it won't help, is the May elections. Now, I've got one simple thought. I'm not going to go through all the different elections in Scotland, Wales, London, all the rest of the place. I've got one thought, and it's this. Quite a lot hinges actually on what happens in Wales and whether or not Keir Starmer's going to see Labour lose Wales for the first time in all of the 26 years that we've had devolution. The point about the new Welsh voting system is that it's a more proportional system, which kind of makes it harder to translate raw votes into outcomes. And I think that's where people might get caught out. So we could wake up after the May elections to discover that Reform didn't bag a victory, don't control the First Minister position there after all. And that completely changes the narrative and shores up Keir Starmer because it's seen as an unexpected victory because we all failed to get our heads around the super complicated voting system.
Well, there's my homework laid out eloquently by Sam. But you remind me, we're talking about May as if it's all like one thing. It's just like this big referendum, put up these leader names of these parties, and it's a referendum on how they're doing. But the complexities do mean that there could be unforeseen consequences there as well for us to get our heads around. We're going to turn to policy and whether the government can actually get some stuff done. Sam, can it?
Well, you had the Prime Minister talking about pulling those levers and they're not delivering. And I actually think he needs to show progress. Right. There are all sorts of areas where I think they struggle. Right. In the NHS strikes me that, things are pretty much going in the wrong direction. In the economy, I think it's going to be a calmer year fiscally from what I can see. But of course, Rachel Reeves just promised to legislate to abolish the OBR assessment of whether or not the government's hit its fiscal rules in the spring. They're just asking the watchdog not to ask the question. Now, of course, they're doing a forecast anyway. We'll be able to work out the result. So that's a weird Jimmy fix, but that's how they're dealing with problems by abolishing people asking difficult questions. Small boats, will that actually change now that there is a policy framework in place? But I want to pick out one. Now, as you know, Anne, all the way through the year, I have focused a lot on growth and the lack of it. And the big target for this government is 1.5 million new homes, right? They don't believe that they can hit it. I don't believe they can hit it. House builders don't believe they can hit it. Ministers don't believe they can hit it.
It's sounding like a really good pledge.
Yeah, and it ain't going to happen. And inside government departments, they know that. They know that. So my question for 2026, emblematic, is are they going to be honest, or are we just going to have a load of people coming out every morning on the morning round going, no, we will. And in 2 years' time, they'll just do what we always knew they were going to do anyway and abandon it just before the election.
That kind of thing does sap faith in a government, though, doesn't it? And I wonder if the way you're thinking is that they put out their big plans that they just can't deliver on anything like the timeline. It makes me think about the NHS and the 10-year plan. I mean, I don't know what you're feeling about that. I think we've got West Streeting very much on the forward foot. But when I look at the complexity of that plan and what it would take for the technological overhaul of the NHS, I think things would have to be moving a lot faster than they've been, which has been bogged down in the everyday about flu and junior doctors.
So one of the big policy things that's going to happen next year is going to be the EU renegotiation. Now, Nick Thomas-Symonds told you that it was all going to be done in a year, in 2026, which to renegotiate the food and agriculture rules so we're in line with Europe and energy market access, which they told us about in December. Big things. Do you think they'll manage it?
They seem to think they can get something done in the first half of the year. That's why Thomas-Symonds has got a full position in Cabinet now. They think there could be something to talk about. I think if it comes to detailed things like rejoining the Erasmus scheme, which was announced just before Christmas, the things that you can get done, you have to trade away something, you have to pay some money. Yes. If you look at the really big things like, the defence procurement, that whole safe loans thing of getting us access, that didn't work out. So, the big stuff still appears to be much more difficult. I think the youth mobility agreement is still very difficult. And I do agree. You mentioned foodstuffs and all those agri-products. When you look into that, there's so many countries there are not going to like the idea of an alignment with the UK unless they're sure they're going to get something back from it. So I'm still less than convinced, if you like, on what you would call the meat and potatoes.
The thing I'm going to watch is the money, right? When we got the details of the Erasmus scheme, it turned out we were paying shed loads more than we had been in order to be part, or had more than we'd been offered at least, in order to be part of that, for really effectively a tiny number of people to benefit. Making the case that the money in is worth the output out is going to be a really tricky deal for this government, I think. And they got away with it before Christmas, but I think it's going to get harder. Right, we are already over the channel into the foreign affairs land. So I want to just, in the last few minutes, talk about President Zelensky and Ukraine, because that has occupied so much of 2025. Where's it going to go in 2026?
Well, I think one could make a prediction that President Zelensky may not be president of Ukraine by the end of the year. Either elections, if that's part of a peace deal, he signaled that he was happy to throw himself into an election. He's got huge domestic problems and not always big popularity, either about the war or other things. So I think he's actually quite vulnerable. I think what he wants is to get this deal and to get a strong arm of the West behind Ukraine and its armed forces, and that he would be prepared, as I read it, to go into the history books on that basis, as long as it was a democratic opposition. It wasn't an opposition that took the job that was clearly just steered by Moscow as a satrapy. So I think he would be okay with that if the bigger deal worked out, and his autobiography would certainly be something, wouldn't it?
What do you think Britain's role is going to be?
So one thing I discovered from a senior MOD person, just as we were coming into the studio to record today, Sam, is that these details of how fast the UK could get into position in the event of a deal coming together and Putin saying yes to it, or indeed, sticking by it for longer than about a day and a half, was that we would need to be ready to get this stabilisation force in the background. The UK is going to be a big part of that if it happens. Now, I gather that is really there. It is ready to go in very minute detail. That is quite a big commitment from the Chief of the Defence Staff and from the Defence Secretary. And the aim of all that, just to remind ourselves, is to have that standby ready to show that you can back up Ukraine with practical measures. That means, of course, being able to put those protective forces, those defence shields, very close to and even into Ukrainian territory, and also to have forces ready to deploy there as well. It would be a major change.
Okay, I completely agree. That's massive. I'm going to put this quite brutally, but I think it's the way the public will say it. British troops near the front line. Do you think the British public are ready for body bags?
No, I don't think they are ready for body bags, but neither do I think that is. Let's very much hope that we're able to get into a position where we have strong defences, but we know that Russia is going to keep pushing us, not only in Ukraine, but at home here and across Europe as a whole. So I would slightly go a different way to you on that question, Sam, because remember that if this comes into being, and it's still a very big if, it is all tied into a peace process, which if it gets going is aimed at de-conflict. It's aimed in the UK, having soldiers there, yes, in Ukraine, but not near the contact line, not near the front line, to support Ukrainians in that big and now well-supported Ukrainian army, which if this happens, would then have American military and intelligence ties to back it up. That might sound a bit odd at the moment, but those are still working really quite well, despite other frictions around Donald Trump and his comments about Europe and other frictions there. The strategy background is that this is aimed at stopping the conflict from re-spiraling if we do indeed end up with our troops there. So it's not a war game scenario where the Russians would shoot down something and we aim to shoot straight back. That it wouldn't be the process. So to that extent, who can predict the future? I don't think the public need be worried so much about the body bag scenario that you say.
Well, success abroad now for British foreign policy sounds like de-escalation. Success at home for British politics sounds like de-escalation. Can our political parties hold it together? But regardless of the outcomes, you and I, war watchers and peacetime chroniclers, will be there every morning in your feed from just before 8 a.m. with politics at Sam and Anne's. For everything that you have done in 2025, thank you for listening and thank you for being here, Anne. It's been a total pleasure. We look more of the same.
We're definitely expecting the unexpected. See you next year. It's been a blast, Sam.